The invitation had already turned to ash by the time Josie reached the bottom of the stairs. She smelled it before she saw it. That particular scent of scorched parchment, of something important reduced to nothing. Her foot landed on the cold stone floor of the great hall, and there it was. A thin curl of black smoke rising from the iron hearth, and her two stepsisters standing before it with their backs turned, whispering and laughing low enough that they thought she couldn't hear. But Josie always heard everything. That was the quiet curse of being an Omega in a house full of betas. She felt too much, sensed too much, and said far too little. "It must have fallen," said Corrine, the elder of the two, without turning around. Her voice carried the practiced innocence of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of cruelty behind a smile. "Such a shame." "Terrible accident," agreed her younger sister Petra, pressing her lips together to hide the smirk pulling at her mouth. Josie stood very still. The cold of the stone floor crept through the thin soles of her worn leather boots, and the draft coming from the narrow corridor behind her pushed against the back of her gray wool cloak. She looked at the hearth, at the last black fragment of parchment curling inward on itself before dissolving entirely. The royal seal, the silver wolf of House Valdrin, had been on that parchment. She had seen it delivered that morning by a royal messenger in crimson livery, his horse steaming in the frost outside the village gate. She had held the envelope in her hands for exactly 4 heartbeats before her stepmother called her to the kitchens. 4 heartbeats. That was all she'd had of it. "You burned it," Josie said, not a question. Corrine turned then, her dark hair pinned high, her gown a deep burgundy that their stepmother had commissioned from the finest seamstress in the valley. She looked at Josie the way one looks at an insect found near the bread. "I told you it fell," she said simply. "The wind from the window." "The windows are shut," Josie said. "They've been shut since the frost came." A silence stretched between them, thin and sharp as a blade. Then Petra shrugged, smoothing the front of her amber skirt. "It doesn't matter, does it? You wouldn't have gone anyway. An Omega at the mating ball." She made a small, dismissive sound. The AlphaKing would have laughed. Josie said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. Years of practice had made it easier than breathing. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen passage, her cloak brushing the stone floor, her hands clasped at her front, exactly the way she always held them when she needed to keep herself from trembling. The smell of wood smoke followed her all the way down the corridor. The mating ball was held once every 7 years in the great hall of Castle Valdrin, when the AlphaKing opened the doors of his seat to unmated wolves of every rank across the 5 territories. It was, by royal decree, an event in which all eligible women, Omega, Beta, or otherwise, were invited to present themselves under the full moon, allowing the ancient bond magic to declare its will. Every unmarried woman of age in the territory of Greymore received an invitation by royal post. Every woman except, it seemed, those whose invitations had been burned. Josie was 23 years old. She had been living in the house of Lord Cedric Hale, her stepfather, a beta lord of middling lands and considerable self-importance, since the age of 12, when her mother died of the winter fever and left her with no one else. She had cooked and mended and carried and kept her head down for 11 years. She had never attended a feast, never been presented at court, never once been allowed to sit at the family table when guests arrived. She had told herself, over and over, that it didn't matter. But the invitation had mattered. Even held for only 4 heartbeats, it had mattered enormously. She pushed open the kitchen door and let the warmth hit her face. The smell of boiling roots and dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the low crackle of the cooking fire, the familiar weight of the iron pot that needed stirring. She picked up the long wooden spoon and began to stir the stew without being asked, because that was what she did. She appeared where she was needed before anyone had to call for her, and she disappeared when her presence became inconvenient. But tonight, something in her chest refused to settle. She thought of the silver seal, the wolves of House Valdrin, pressed into crimson wax. She thought of what the village women had whispered at the well last week, that this Alpha King was different from his father, that he had returned from the northern wars changed, that he asked questions at court that made his council uneasy, that he walked the corridors of his castle in the deep hours of the night as if chasing something he couldn't name. She thought of the full moon, which would rise tonight above the towers of Castle Valdrin, 4 leagues to the north. She stirred the pot. Outside, the wind picked up and flung itself against the shuttered windows, and the flame in the cooking hearth guttered and leaned. By the time the household retired, frost had formed on the inside of the kitchen window pane, tracing white fingers across the glass in patterns that almost looked like writing. Josie banked the cooking fire, hung the pot hook higher to keep the embers from catching the wood, and sat on her low stool near the warmth. Her cloak was still around her shoulders. She hadn't taken it off all evening. She didn't intend to sleep. She didn't know what she intended. The candle beside her burned down past its 2nd mark, then its 3rd. The house grew quiet around her. The creak of the upper floors settling, the distant sound of Corinne's door closing, the muffled sound of Petra's laughter ending abruptly as sleep took her. Lord Cedric had gone to his study after supper, with a flagon of dark wine and a self-satisfied expression, no doubt rehearsing the conversation he would have at the ball, for Corinne and Petra were attending, of course, dressed in new gowns, with their hair curled and their status carefully rehearsed. Betas could attend. Betas were welcome. Omegas were tolerated when their invitations arrived, when they weren't burned. Josie pressed her palms flat on her knees and stared at the orange pulse of the banked embers. Then, at what she judged to be just past the midnight bell, she heard the hoofbeats. Not the soft, scattered sound of a lone rider passing through the village lane. Something heavier, deliberate. The rhythmic thunder of a significant number of horses, moving in formation, slowing as they reached the gate of Lord Cedric's manor. Josie stood up. She crossed to the kitchen door that opened onto the side yard, cracked it an inch, and looked out into the night. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. The moon was enormous above the tree line, full and white, washing the frost-covered yard in silver light. And there, beyond the wooden gate, she could see them. Riders in dark armor, their horses dark as smoke, breath steaming in the frozen air. Torches held high. A banner she recognized even in the dark. The silver wolf on black. House Valdrin. And at the front of the column, sitting very still on a horse larger than any she had ever seen, was a man whose black braided hair fell past his shoulders, whose jaw was set like iron, and whose pale blue eyes were scanning the face of the manor house, with an expression she could not yet read. He had come here. The Alpha King himself had come here. And then, as if pulled by something she could not explain, his gaze dropped from the upper windows, traveled across the frost-bright yard, and landed directly on the narrow crack of the kitchen door. Directly on her. Josie stopped breathing. His eyes didn't move, neither did hers. Then, slowly, deliberately, he dismounted. Josie did not move. There was something about the way Tristan dismounted that made it impossible to look away. He didn't descend from his horse with the urgency of a man on pressing business, nor with the arrogance of a king accustomed to receiving bowed heads at every threshold. He moved with the absolute stillness of someone who had already decided what came next, and who required no one's permission to proceed. His black boots met the frost-covered ground without a sound. He said something to the rider nearest him, a broad-shouldered man with a gamma's silver braid on his collar, and that man nodded once, sharply, and remained where he was. The rest of the column held formation at the gate. Only Tristan walked forward, his black fur mantle cutting a dark shape against the silver-washed yard, the torchlight catching the bronze buckles of the leather straps crossing his chest. He was walking toward the kitchen door, toward her. Josie took one step back, then stopped herself. Running would be absurd. Hiding would be worse. She straightened her spine inside her gray wool cloak, lifted her chin exactly 1/fraction of an inch, just enough to feel like herself, and opened the door fully. The cold rushed in around her like a tide. Tristan stopped 3 paces away. Up close, he was larger than she had processed from a distance, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested not ceremony but genuine use, a body shaped by war, not display. His black hair fell in thick braids past his collarbones, and a thin scar ran from just below his left cheekbone to the edge of his jaw, pale against the dark stubble. His eyes were the color of winter sky just before full dark, a blue so pale it was nearly silver. Those eyes moved over her once, not the way men looked at Omega women in this village, with dismissal or appetite or pity. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they have been searching for and are not yet willing to believe they have found. "You are Josie," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the particular weight of a man unused to repeating himself. "I am," she said. Her own voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that. "You did not attend the mating ball tonight?" "No." "Your invitation was delivered this morning. I confirmed it myself with the courier before he left the castle." Something tightened in Josie's chest. She held his gaze. "It did not reach me." A pause. His eyes moved, briefly, barely, toward the interior of the house behind her, as if he could see through stone and corridor to the iron hearth in the great hall where the ash still sat. Then they returned to her face. "I see," he said. 2 words. Quiet as a blade being set down on a table rather than drawn, and yet something in them made the hairs rise on the back of her neck, because she understood, with the instinct that Omegas were said to carry in their blood, that whatever he had seen, he had already understood completely, and that he was choosing, for now, not to say the rest of it aloud. "May I come in?" he said. Also not a question, but offered with just enough of a pause that it could have been one, if she had chosen to treat it that way. Josie stepped aside. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it. Not because he crowded the space. He didn't. He stood near the center of the room with a kind of deliberate stillness, his hands loose at his sides, and looked around the way a man looks at a place he is trying to understand, quickly and honestly. The hanging herbs, the worn wooden table scrubbed pale with years of use, the low stool near the banked fire, the single candle, burned past its 3rd mark. His gaze landed on the stool and stayed there a half-second longer than anywhere else. "You were sitting up," he said. "I couldn't sleep. Because of the invitation." She didn't answer. He didn't need her to. He moved to the table and rested one hand on the edge of it. Not sitting, not imposing, simply present, and looked at her directly. "I want to understand what happened in this house tonight. I am asking you to tell me plainly, without softening it for my comfort or for the protection of anyone under this roof." Josie studied him for a moment. In 11 years in Lord Cedric's house, no one had ever asked her to speak plainly for their benefit. Every word she had ever offered had been carefully measured against the cost of saying it. "My stepsisters burned it," she said, "in the great hall hearth. I came downstairs and the ash was still warm." Something moved through his expression, not anger exactly, but a hardening, like metal cooling into its final shape. Did they admit it? They said it fell. The windows were shut. There was no wind. "Did your stepfather know?" "I don't know what he knew. He was in his study." She paused. "He knew Corinne and Petra were attending. He paid a great deal for their gowns." Tristan said nothing for a moment. He looked at the candle flame, which had steadied now that the door was closed and the draft was gone. In the warm light, the scar along his jaw cast a thin shadow. "The mating ball runs until the 3rd bell past midnight," he said finally. "It has not yet closed." Josie blinked. "I'm sorry? The event is still open." He looked back at her. "Under royal law, any woman whose invitation was received and lost due to circumstances beyond her control retains the right of attendance until the final bell. That right does not expire because someone in this house decided it was inconvenient." She stared at him. "You rode 4 leagues in the frost to tell me about a legal provision." "I rode 4 leagues in the frost," he said, with the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Because when I stood in the hall of Castle Valdrin tonight and felt the bond pull in the room, it did not point to anyone present." The silence that followed was absolute. Josie's hands, which had been clasped in front of her as they always were when she was keeping herself steady, went very still. "Bond pull," she repeated carefully. "The ancient mate sense. Every AlphaKing before me has described it at the mating ball. A pull toward a specific direction, like a current in a river." His voice remained level, but she noticed that his hand on the edge of the table had tightened fractionally. Tonight it pointed north of the hall, beyond the castle walls, down the valley road. He held her gaze. To this house. The candle flame leaned sideways, though there was no wind. Josie looked at the fire, then at the man standing in her kitchen, the most powerful alpha in the 5 territories, in full battle leather and a wolf fur mantle, standing next to her worn wooden table as if it were the most natural place in the world for him to be. She thought of Kareen's voice, an Omega at the mating ball. The AlphaKing would have laughed. He was not laughing. "I don't know what you expect me to say," she said honestly. "I don't expect you to say anything," he replied. "I came to offer you your right. What you do with it is your decision." He straightened from the table and held out his hand, not commanding, not demanding, simply extending, an open palm. "There is still time, if you choose to come." Josie looked at his hand. She looked at her own, reddened from cold water and kitchen work, the knuckles slightly rough, a small burn scar on the inside of her right wrist from a cooking accident 3 winters ago. Not the hands of a woman who had been prepared for a mating ball, not the gown, not the hair, not any of it. She thought of the ash in the hearth. She thought of 4 heartbeats holding a silver seal. She unclenched her hands from each other and reached out. The ride to Castle Valdrin took less time than it should have. Or perhaps Josie simply lost track of it, too occupied with staying upright on the enormous dark horse that one of Tristan's guards had offered her, the animal's warmth seeping through her wool cloak as the frost-bright road unrolled beneath them. Tristan rode at her side, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm if she had wanted to. She didn't, but she was aware of it. The castle appeared through the tree line as a mass of dark stone against the moonlit sky, torches burning in every window of the great tower, the sound of music drifting faintly down the hillside even before the gates came into view. As they rode beneath the iron portcullis, guards in silver and black snapped to attention, and Josie felt a ripple move through the column. A subtle shift in posture, in awareness, as word passed silently that the king had returned, and that he had not returned alone. She was aware of eyes, dozens of them, on the women gathered in the torchlit courtyard, on the servants who paused mid-task, on the nobles who stood near the great hall entrance, and whose conversations dropped to murmurs as Tristan guided his horse to the mounting block and dismounted, then turned and offered her his hand to descend. She took it. His grip was firm and warm against her cold fingers, and he did not release her hand immediately once she was on the ground. From the top of the stone steps leading into the great hall, a woman watched them with an expression that Josie couldn't quite read. Dark-eyed, silver-haired, dressed in deep green robes that marked her as a member of the High Council. Beside her stood a younger man, perhaps 30, with a Gamma's silver braid and a jaw set in barely concealed disapproval. "The council will not be pleased," Josie said quietly, not to anyone in particular. They rarely are, Tristan replied, equally quiet. He had not yet let go of her hand. She looked up at him. He was already looking at her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, while the torches burned around them, and the music from the great hall poured out into the cold night air. Then the midnight bell began to toll from the castle tower, deep, resonant, rolling out across the frozen valley. 1, 2, 3. Josie counted. On the 4th toll, Tristan finally released her hand, but he did not step away. "The ball closes on the 12th bell," he said. She held his gaze. "Then we still have time." Something shifted in those pale blue eyes, something she didn't have the words for yet, but recognized in her chest as the feeling of a door she had thought permanently locked beginning, very slowly, to open. She turned toward the steps, and she walked up them. The great hall of Castle Valdrin smelled of pine resin and beeswax candles, of roasted meat and spiced wine warming in iron cauldrons near the far wall, of wool and leather, and the particular sharp sweet scent of wolf-kind gathered in a large space under a full moon. The ceiling vaulted high overhead, the stone ribbed with dark timber beams from which banners hung, the silver wolf of House Valdrin alternating with the colors of the 5 territories, swaying gently in the warm air rising from a dozen iron chandeliers packed with candles. Josie stepped through the great doors and stopped breathing for a moment. She had imagined this room, in the way that people who have been kept from beautiful things sometimes allow themselves to imagine them in the quiet hours before sleep, carefully, briefly, and with the practiced discipline of someone who knows not to want too much. She had imagined high ceilings and candlelight. She had not imagined this, the sheer living warmth of it, the sound of a string quartet in the far gallery, the low roar of 100 conversations layered one over another, the women in gowns of crimson and amber and forest green, moving through the crowd like embers drifting from a fire. And then, every single one of those conversations began, one by one, to stop. It didn't happen all at once. It moved through the room like a ripple across still water, starting nearest the doors and spreading inward. Heads turning, voices dropping, eyes finding her, finding Tristan at her side, finding the fact that the AlphaKing, who had left this hall over an hour ago without explanation, had returned with an unknown woman in a gray wool traveling cloak and worn leather boots. Her blonde hair still in its simple travel braid, her cheeks flushed from the cold. No prepared gown, no jewels, no family escort, no announcement, just Josie, standing in the doorway of the most powerful hall in the 5 territories, trying very hard to keep her breathing even. Tristan stepped up beside her, not in front of her, not ahead of her, but precisely alongside. And the simple fact of his positioning sent its own message to everyone watching. He did not look at the crowd. He looked briefly at her, and when she met his gaze, he gave the smallest nod, as if to say, "I see you. You are standing. That is enough." She exhaled slowly and moved forward into the hall. She found them within the first minute. Of course she did. The hall was large, but Corinne's burgundy gown was the exact color of dried blood, and Petra's amber skirts caught the candlelight in a way that their seamstress had no doubt intended to be alluring and had achieved to reasonable effect. They were standing near the spiced wine table with their stepfather, Lord Cedric, who was mid-conversation with a beta lord from the eastern reaches and wearing the expression of a man deeply satisfied with his own presence. Corinne saw Josie first. The color left her face so completely and so quickly that for a moment she looked like a painting left out in the rain. Her dark eyes moved from Josie's face to Tristan's, then back to Josie's, then to their joined proximity, for Tristan was walking close enough that his arm nearly brushed her shoulder. And the wine cup in Corinne's hand tilted slightly before she caught it. Petra turned to see what her sister was staring at. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Lord Cedric, still speaking to the Eastern Lord, had not yet noticed. He was describing, from what Josie could hear as she passed within earshot, the exceptional social prospects of his 2 daughters. She did not stop walking. She did not look at them again. But she felt the exact moment that Lord Cedric's companion stopped listening to him, and the moment that Lord Cedric himself turned to see why, and the moment his voice died completely in his throat. It was, she thought distantly, a very small and very specific satisfaction. A woman intercepted them before they reached the center of the hall. She was the same silver-haired figure Josie had seen at the top of the steps in the courtyard. Up close, her dark eyes were sharp and assessing, her green council robes trimmed with the black wolf sigil at the collar. She moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone accustomed to navigating court without being stopped, and she placed herself in their path with a smile that was entirely architectural. "My king," she said, inclining her head precisely the correct amount. "You've returned." Her gaze moved to Josie with the smooth professionalism of someone performing an evaluation while appearing to do no such thing. "And you've brought a guest." "Councilwoman Elara," Tristan said. "This is Josie. Her invitation to this evening's event was destroyed before it reached her. She is here under the provisions of the Royal Attendance Charter." "Of course," Elara said, still smiling. "How fortunate that the charter provides for such circumstances." She looked at Josie directly for the first time. "And from which family, my dear?" "Hale," Josie said. "By marriage. My mother was born of the Wren line of the Northern Valley settlements." Something moved across Elara's expression, too fast to catch fully, but it was there. A flicker of something that was not the polished surprise of a courtier encountering an unexpected name, but something older. Something that looked, for just a fraction of a second, like recognition. "The Wren line," Elara repeated. "You know it?" Josie asked. "I know of it," Elara said smoothly. "An old line, very old." She looked at Tristan. "My king, the High Council would appreciate a word before the final bell, when you have a moment." The smile remained. "No urgency." She moved away into the crowd before either of them could respond. Josie watched her go. "She knows something," she said quietly. "Elara always knows something," Tristan replied, with a flatness in his tone that suggested this was not a recent discovery. "The question with her is always what she intends to do with it." The gamma she had noticed earlier, the broad-shouldered man with the silver braid who had stayed at the gate when Tristan dismounted, found them near the center of the hall not long after. Up close, he was younger than Josie had estimated from a distance, perhaps 5 years older than herself, with a square jaw and dark eyes, and the look of a man who had decided to be skeptical of something and was working out the most efficient way to express it. "Roan," Tristan said, without particular inflection. "My king," said the man called Roan. His eyes settled on Josie with the careful neutrality of someone choosing, for now, not to say what he was actually thinking. "I wasn't aware the charter provision would be exercised tonight. It rarely is," Tristan said. "It was needed." Roan looked at Josie again. "The council is already asking questions. Let them ask. The Lord Hale is asking louder ones." Something in Josie's stomach tightened. She looked toward the wine table. Lord Cedric was no longer there. Neither were her stepsisters. "Where is he?" she asked. Roan glanced at her. The first time he had addressed her directly, even without words. She got the impression it was a small concession he was making deliberately, as if measuring how much to offer. "He went toward the eastern corridor about 10 minutes ago, with the councilwoman." Tristan turned his head slightly at that. The two men exchanged a look that carried a conversation Josie wasn't privy to yet, and then Tristan's expression settled back into its usual stillness. "Keep watch on it," he said to Roan. Roan nodded once. But before he stepped away, he looked at Josie a final time. And this time the assessment in his gaze was slightly different. still guarded, still not fully given, but no longer entirely closed. "For what it's worth," he said, with a reluctance that seemed genuine rather than polished. "You're steadier than most people who've walked in here tonight, and most of them had weeks to prepare." He was gone before she could respond. The string quartet in the gallery shifted into a slower piece, something low and resonant that moved through the floorboards as much as through the air, and the crowd thinned near the center of the hall as some guests drifted toward the long tables of food along the south wall. Josie found herself standing in a pocket of relative quiet, the candlelight warm on her face, the stone floor solid beneath her worn boots. Tristan stood beside her. He had not left her side since they entered. "You should probably speak with your guests," she said. "I will," he agreed. He did not move. She looked at him sideways. "Is this how you usually conduct a mating ball?" Ignoring half the room to stand next to someone who arrived in a travel cloak. The corner of his mouth shifted, that same almost but not quite expression from the kitchen, more present this time, more willing to be seen. "No," he said. "This is not how I usually conduct anything." "Then why?" "Because the pull is still here," he said. "Simple, direct, no ornamentation. It doesn't go away when I look somewhere else. It hasn't weakened since I crossed through your kitchen door." He paused, then added, with the careful honesty of a man unaccustomed to offering it but choosing to anyway. "I have been at war for 3 years. I have sat through 3 sessions of the High Council this week alone. I have shaken more hands and listened to more petitions and made more decisions in the last month than I care to count." He looked at her. "And this is the first moment since I returned to this castle that I have stood still without needing to be somewhere else immediately." Josie was quiet for a moment. "That," she said finally, "is either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time, or a very sophisticated political maneuver." "I don't have the energy left for sophisticated maneuvers," he said. And something in the way he said it, not self-pitying, just matter-of-fact, made her believe him completely. She looked at the room, at the candles burning in their hundreds, at the women in their prepared gowns, at the lords and betas in their formal leathers, at the banners of the 5 territories swaying above it all. She thought of Corinne's voice again. The AlphaKing would have laughed. "My stepsister told me tonight," Josie said quietly, "that an Omega at the mating ball was something to be laughed at, that I didn't belong in a room like this." Tristan was quiet for a moment. Then, "And what do you think?" She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "I think," she said, "that I have been told what I don't belong to for so long that I'm not entirely sure I know the answer to that yet." He turned to look at her fully then, and she met his gaze, and in the warmth of the candlelight his pale blue eyes held something that was not pity, and was not strategy, and was not the careful performance of a king in a public room. It was simply the look of a person recognizing another person, cleanly and without pretense. "Then perhaps," he said, "that is what tonight is for." The bell in the great tower had not yet tolled its 12th count, but far down the eastern corridor, out of sight and earshot of the candlelit hall, Lord Cedric Hale and Councilwoman Alara were deep in a conversation that neither of them would choose to have witnessed. And in that conversation, a name had just been spoken. The Wren line. And the expression on Alara's face, free now from the architecture of her public smile, was not recognition after all. It was fear. Josie did not sleep that night in Castle Valdrin. Not because she was uncomfortable. The chamber they gave her was warmer than any room she had occupied in 11 years in Lord Cedric's house, with a proper feather bed and wool blankets heavy enough to press her flat, and a small iron brazier in the corner that breathed steady heat into the stone walls. Not because the bed was strange, or the sounds of the castle unfamiliar, though both were true. She didn't sleep because her mind would not stop moving. She lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Alara's face at the moment she had said the Wren line, that flicker behind the polished expression. There and gone so fast that Josie might have dismissed it entirely if she had not spent 11 years learning to read the faces of people who did not wish to be read. She thought about Lord Cedric disappearing into the eastern corridor. She thought about Roan's careful eyes and the conversation he and Tristan had exchanged in the silent language of men who had stood shoulder to shoulder through something difficult and come out the other side still standing. She thought about what Tristan had said. The pull is still here. She pressed her palms flat against the wool blanket and breathed. She did not know what the bond pull meant for her. She had heard of it, the same way she had heard of everything she was never supposed to need, from fragments of overheard conversations, from the village women at the well, from the old stories her mother had told her in the last winter before the fever came. The mate sense was said to be unmistakable for an alpha. For an omega, the stories varied. Some said they felt it as warmth. Some said it was like hearing a sound just below the range of ordinary hearing, a frequency that lived in the chest rather than the ears. Josie pressed one hand to her sternum now, in the dark, and felt her own heartbeat. Steady, a little fast, but steady. She thought, I don't know enough. I don't know nearly enough about any of this. And then, more quietly, underneath that, but I am still here. I walked up those steps. I did not run. That, at least, was something. Morning came gray and cold through the narrow window, the frost still thick on the outer stone. Josie rose before the castle bells, washed her face in the basin of water that had been left on the small wooden table near the brazier, cold now, but clean, and rebraided her hair by feel, her fingers moving through the familiar motions while she looked out the window at the pale sky above the eastern tree line. A servant girl knocked and entered shortly after, carrying a tray with bread and soft cheese, and a small pot of something warm that smelled of honey and dried blackberries. She was perhaps 17, with a beta's subtle ease of manner and wide brown eyes that kept flicking to Josie's face with barely contained curiosity. "The king requests your company at morning council," the girl said, setting the tray on the table. "When you are ready. There is no particular hour required." Those were his words exactly. She hesitated. "He also said to tell you that you are not obligated." Josie looked at her. "He said that specifically? That I was not obligated?" "3 times, my lady. Once to the head steward and twice in the message to me." The girl's expression suggested she found this notable. The steward nearly fell over. Josie almost smiled. "Tell him I'll come." The morning council chamber was smaller than she expected. A long room off the eastern corridor with stone walls hung with maps, a heavy oak table down the center, and tall, narrow windows that let in pale winter light without warmth. 7 people sat around the table when Josie arrived, and 5 of them looked up at her entry with expressions ranging from careful neutrality to barely concealed displeasure. Tristan stood at the far end of the table, bent over a large parchment map with a measuring rod in one hand. He straightened when she entered, and something in his posture changed in a way she was beginning to recognize. A fractional release of tension, like a bowstring easing back from full draw. "Josie," he said, and then to the room. "Everyone here knows why she is present. If there are objections, they may be placed before me in writing before the midday meal. Verbally, we are done with that subject." Silence. Roan, seated to Tristan's left, was watching Josie with the same guarded assessment as the night before. Not hostile, not welcoming, simply measuring. She met his gaze directly and held it for a moment, before taking the empty chair that the servant girl indicated near the foot of the table. Ilara was not in the room. Josie noticed that immediately. The silver-haired councilwoman's chair at Tristan's right hand sat empty, a folded piece of parchment placed neatly on its surface. Josie's eyes moved to it once and then away, and she kept her hands flat on the table in front of her and listened. The council meeting covered 3 subjects: a border dispute in the southern territory of Ashval, where a Beta Lord had begun encroaching on Omega settlement lands and had thus far ignored 2 royal notices to cease. A report from the eastern reaches about an early and unusually heavy snowfall blocking the mountain pass before the winter supply caravans had completed their final run, and a petition from the Healers Guild in the capital requesting formal recognition and protected status under royal charter. It was this last subject that made Josie sit forward slightly without meaning to. The man presenting the petition, a thin, gray-bearded beta named Aldrich, who wore the Healers Guild mark stitched on his collar, was describing the situation with the careful neutrality of someone who had rehearsed removing all emotion from the words in order to be taken seriously. Healers in the outer settlements, he explained, particularly those serving Omega communities, had no legal protection against lords who chose to conscript their services without compensation, relocate them without consent, or simply dismiss them when their usefulness was deemed concluded. 3 healers in the Valley territories were removed from their posts this past season alone, Aldrich said. One of them had served her settlement for 19 years. Josie thought of the old healer woman in the village below Lord Cedric's manor, a quiet Omega named Marin, who had treated Josie's burns when she was 15, who had pressed dried herbs into her hands and said nothing about the fact that the burns were consistent with having held a hot iron for longer than an accident would account for. Marin had been gone from the village for 2 years now. Josie had never found out where. "Grant it," Tristan said, before Aldrich finished his closing remarks. Aldrich blinked. "My king, the council had suggested a review period of—" "The review period is concluded," Tristan said. "The petition is granted. Draw up the charter language and have it on my table before sunset." Across the table, one of the council members, a broad beta lord with a gray beard, and the permanently aggrieved expression of a man whose opinions were not sought as often as he felt they deserved to be, exhaled through his nose in a way that communicated significant disapproval without technically constituting an objection. Roan, Josie noticed, was watching her again. She realized, a half-second too late, that her expression had shifted when the petition was granted, that something had moved across her face that was not the studied neutrality she had worn for the rest of the meeting, and that Roan had caught it. She smoothed her expression. He looked away. But she had the impression, from the slight adjustment of his posture, that he had filed whatever he had seen somewhere and intended to think about it later. The meeting concluded before the midday bells. As the council members gathered their parchments and rose from the table, Alara appeared in the doorway. Not hurrying, not apologizing, simply arriving as if her lateness were a choice she had made with full awareness and no particular concern. She looked at Tristan with her careful smile. "My king, forgive my absence this morning. I had correspondence that required attention." "From whom?" Tristan asked. A brief pause. "Old acquaintances," Alara said. "Nothing pressing." Her dark eyes moved to Josie with the smoothness of a woman whose gaze never arrived anywhere accidentally. "I hope the morning was informative." "Very," Josie said. Alara smiled more fully. "Good. I wonder—" She addressed Josie directly now, with the warmth of someone extending genuine interest and the precision of someone who had already planned every word. "If you might walk with me this afternoon. The Eastern Gallery has a fine view of the valley in the winter light, and I find I have questions about your mother's family that I confess I would very much like to discuss." Every instinct Josie owned said, "Be careful." She smiled pleasantly. "I'd be glad to," she said. The Eastern Gallery was long and cold despite the tapestries on the walls. Hunting scenes, battle scenes, the occasional rendering of the moon above dark forests. Their footsteps echoed on the stone floor, and the pale winter light came through the tall windows and flat, even sheets that cast no warmth. Alara walked with her hands folded inside her green sleeves, at a pace designed for conversation rather than destination. "Your mother," she began, without preamble. "Her name was Seren, of the Wren line of the Northern Valleys." Josie kept her pace even. "That's correct." "She died when you were 12. "Yes." "Of the winter fever, the record shows." Alara's voice was smooth. A great loss. She was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman. Something shifted in Josie's chest at the past tense. The old familiar ache that never entirely left. Just moved to different depths depending on the day. She breathed past it. You knew her. It was not a question. She said it the way Tristan had spoken to her the night before. Flat, certain, leaving no room for the evasion that a question would have permitted. Alara was quiet for 3 steps. Then, I knew of her, as I said last night. You said you knew of the Wren line. This morning you used my mother's name without being told it. Another pause. Longer this time. You are very observant, Alara said. I have had to be, Josie replied. They stopped at the window at the far end of the gallery. Below, the valley spread white and still, the frost-covered fields broken only by the dark line of the road south toward the village and the gray smudge of Lord Cedric's manor on the far hillside. Alara looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to Josie with an expression that had, for the first time, something genuine in it. Not the polished warmth of court, but something underneath that, older and less comfortable. Your mother did not die of the winter fever, she said. The words landed in the cold air between them and stayed there. Josie did not move. Say that again. The fever was real, Alara said carefully, but Seren Wren was an Omega, with a gift that certain people in this kingdom had spent years trying to suppress. When she could no longer be suppressed, she stopped, looked at the valley. The fever was helped along. The cold of the stone floor seemed to travel upward through Josie's boots and into her bones. Helped, she repeated. Her voice was very quiet. By whom? Alara looked at her. And in those dark, careful eyes was an answer she had not yet spoken. But Josie, with the instincts of a woman who had spent 11 years reading the faces of people who did not wish to be read, already knew. She already knew. The name Alara would not say aloud was Lord Cedric Hale. Josie knew it the way she knew the cold of the kitchen floor before dawn, the way she knew the sound of her stepsister's laughter when something had gone wrong for her specifically. Not because someone had told her, but because 11 years of living inside a lie eventually teaches you the shape of it, even before you can name all its edges. She stood at the gallery window and looked at the gray smudge of the manor on the far hillside, and felt something move through her that was not grief and was not rage, but was the particular sensation of a long-carried weight finally being set down on solid ground and identified for what it actually was. He was in debt to someone, Alara said quietly, still looking at the valley. Your mother's gift, the Wren line, carries a rare form of Omega sight, the ability to sense deception, to read the truth beneath spoken words, made her dangerous to certain arrangements. Lord Cedric had dealings he could not afford to have seen clearly. She paused. When your mother began asking questions, he could not answer. He sought assistance from a man with the means to end the questioning. What man? Josie said. His name was Dorian. He served on the High Council 12 years ago, in the seat I now occupy. Alara turned from the window. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. I took his seat because he was removed. I did not know, when I accepted the position, the full extent of what he had done while he held it. I have spent the last 6 years learning it piece by piece. And Lord Cedric, Josie said. Does he know you know? He suspects, Alara said, which is why he came to find me last night, in the eastern corridor. He wanted to understand how much I had told the king. He wanted to know if your presence here was accidental or deliberate. Her dark eyes held Josie steadily. I told him it was accidental, that you had simply appeared under the charter provision, and that the king had acted on instinct. Was that a lie? It was a delay, Alara said. There is a difference. She reached into the inner fold of her green robe and withdrew a small piece of folded parchment, which she held out to Josie without ceremony. This is the record I have assembled. Testimony from 2 servants who were present in your mother's household in her final weeks. A letter in Dorian's own hand, referencing Lord Cedric by name, and the matter he was paid to resolve. It is not everything, but it is enough. Josie took the parchment. It was thin and worn at the folds, the kind of document that had been handled many times, carefully, over many years. "Why are you giving this to me?" she said, "and not to the king directly?" Alara was quiet for a moment. "Because it concerns your mother," she said finally, "and because you have the right to decide what is done with it." She found Tristan in the castle's inner training yard. He was alone, or as alone as an AlphaKing ever was, which meant Roan stood at the far end of the yard near the gate with his arms crossed and the careful non-expression of a man deliberately not watching. Tristan was working through a sequence of sword forms without armor, his black braids tied back, his leather vest open at the collar against the cold. The movements were practiced and fluid, the blade catching the flat winter light with each turn. He stopped when he heard her boots on the stone. He did not need to look up to know it was her. She understood that now, with the particular awareness of someone beginning to understand what the bond pull actually meant in practice. He simply stopped, lowered the blade, and turned. She crossed the yard and held out the folded parchment. He took it, read it again. The training yard was very quiet. Somewhere above them, a crow called once from the battlements and was silent. When Tristan looked up, his pale blue eyes had the quality of deep winter water, still on the surface and very cold beneath. "How long have you had this?" 20 minutes, she said. Alara gave it to me in the gallery. "She's had this evidence for how long?" She said 6 years. Something moved across his jaw, a tightening, a brief compression, and then his expression returned to its controlled stillness. But she could see the effort of it now. She was beginning to be able to see the difference between his natural stillness and the deliberate kind. And this was the deliberate kind. "Roan," he said, without raising his voice. Roan was already moving. Lord Cedric Hale was found in the castle's guest quarters, where he had remained since the previous night, in the apparent confidence that his attendance at the mating ball as escort to his daughters gave him unassailable standing. He was in the middle of a late breakfast when Roan's men knocked. A proper knock, formal and official, the kind that is not actually a question. Josie was not present for what followed. She had not asked to be, and Tristan had not suggested it. What she knew of it came from Roan, who found her in the main hall an hour later, and stood before her with the slightly adjusted posture of a man recalibrating something he had already decided. "He confessed faster than I expected," Roan said, without particular inflection. "Men like Cedric Hale usually require more pressure. I think he'd been afraid of this conversation for 11 years, and found the actual occurrence almost a relief." A pause. He named Dorian as the primary instrument. He named 2 others who assisted. All of it is consistent with what Alara's record shows. Josie nodded slowly. Roan looked at her for a moment with his careful dark eyes. Then he said, in a tone that was not quite an apology, but was the closest thing to one that his particular manner of speaking seemed to permit. "I was not generous to you when you arrived last night. I want you to know I understand the difference between caution and unfairness, and I crossed it." She looked at him. "You didn't know me." "No," he agreed. "But that's not entirely why." He seemed to consider whether to say the next thing, then said it anyway. "I've watched the king carry this kingdom on his own since he came back from the Northern Wars. 3 years of watching him sit in council chambers making decisions that were right and cost him something every single time, with no one beside him who wasn't calculating the angle." He paused. "I was protecting him from the possibility of another angle. I should have looked more carefully before I decided that was what you were." Josie was quiet for a moment. Then, "You can keep protecting him. I don't object to that." Roan studied her, and then, briefly, genuinely, he almost smiled. "No," he said. "I don't think you do." Karine and Petra left Castle Valdrin that afternoon under escort, their trunks loaded onto a cart without ceremony. Josie watched from the window of the eastern gallery as the cart moved through the castle gate and down the valley road, the burgundy flash of Corine's cloak visible until the tree line swallowed it. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. Not satisfaction exactly, and not relief exactly, but something quieter than either. The specific stillness of an absence where a chronic pain had been. She heard his footstep behind her before he spoke. She was getting used to that. "They'll be placed with distant family in the western reaches," Tristan said, coming to stand beside her at the window. "They won't be imprisoned. What they did was cruel, but the law's reach only extends so far in matters of family and household." "I know," Josie said. "I'm not asking for more than that." He looked at her profile. "What are you asking for?" She considered the question seriously. Outside, the cart had disappeared into the trees, and the valley was white and still beneath the pale sky. Somewhere far below, the village road was empty, and Lord Cedric's manor sat silent on its hillside, the royal seal already placed on its gate, the household accounts already under review by Tristan's appointed steward. Whatever Cedric had built on the foundations of what he had done would be methodically, carefully dismantled. "I want to find the healer," Josie said. "Marin, the woman from our village who was dismissed 2 years ago. I want to know she's safe." Tristan nodded once. "I'll have Roan begin inquiries today." "And I want to understand what Alara meant by the wren gift," she continued. "The sight she described. If I carry it, I want to understand it. I don't want to be afraid of something that was my mother's." "That I can help with," Tristan said. "There are records in the castle library, the old lineage texts. Some of them detail Omega gifts by bloodline. We can look together if you want company." She turned to look at him then. The winter light was flat and even on his face, catching the pale line of the scar along his jaw, and his blue eyes were steady and quiet, watching her with the same quality she had first recognized in her kitchen doorway, as if he were looking at something he was not yet willing to assume he fully understood, but was entirely willing to keep looking at. "You keep offering me things," she said. "Time, company, the charter provision, the choice about the parchment." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone choosing a strategic answer, but the silence of someone being honest with themselves before speaking. "Because you have spent a very long time in a house where things were taken from you before you could decide if you wanted them," he said. "I have no interest in being another version of that." The words landed simply, without ornament, and sat in the air between them with the comfortable weight of something true. Josie looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window, and after a breath she said, "I'll take the company. In the library." They spent the afternoon among the old texts. The castle library was a long, low-ceilinged room deep in the north tower, smelling of aged parchment and cedar oil, and the particular dry dust of knowledge kept in cool stone rooms for generations. Josie sat across from Tristan at a heavy reading table with a candle between them, the old lineage texts spread open, and Roan appeared in the doorway an hour before sunset to report that Marin the healer had been located, living in a small settlement 2 valleys east, having established herself there after her dismissal. Old and somewhat diminished in health but alive and tended. Josie pressed her hands flat on the open page before her and breathed. "I'd like to send for her," she said, "if that's possible." "Already arranged," Roan said. And this time, he did not hesitate before he said it. Marin arrived at Castle Valdrin 4 days later, carried in a covered cart with warm blankets and a basket of food, that she had apparently argued about accepting, and then accepted entirely. She was older than Josie remembered, smaller, her white hair thin, her hands more crooked at the knuckles. But her eyes were the same sharp, quiet amber, and when Josie came to the courtyard to meet her and the old woman took her face in both worn hands and looked at her, she said, "There you are. I always wondered where you'd land." Josie covered the old woman's hands with her own and held on for a moment. "You're staying," she said. "If you want to. The Healers Guild has royal protection now. You'd have a place here." Marin looked past her at the castle, at the silver wolf banner above the gate, at the figure of Tristan standing back near the entrance giving them space without being absent. She looked back at Josie. "Your mother would have laughed," she said softly, and then cried, and then laughed again. "I know," Josie said. Her voice caught once, briefly, then steadied. Spring came slowly to the valley of Castle Valdrin, the frost retreating from the fields in stages, the road south becoming passable again by the time the first green appeared on the tree line. By then, the castle had changed in the small ways that places change when the people inside them begin, quietly and without announcement, to be genuinely well. Ilara remained on the High Council. Her role altered, her relationship with Josie complicated and honest, in the way that relationships between two people who have navigated the same difficult territory from different sides tend to be. They were not friends, precisely, but they understood each other, and in the halls of power, that was its own kind of alliance. Roan remained exactly what he was, loyal, direct, difficult to surprise, and, once his assessment was completed and his decision made, entirely committed. Josie valued that more than ease would have cost her. Marin settled in the castle's healer wing and proceeded within a fortnight to reorganize it entirely, to the simultaneous exasperation and deep relief of every person who required her services. And Josie learned the shape of her mother's gift. Slowly, carefully, with the old lineage texts and Tristan's patient company, and the growing understanding that the Wren's sight was not a weapon and not a burden, but simply a way of seeing clearly in rooms where clarity was unwelcome. She learned to trust it. She learned to trust herself. On the evening of the first true spring day, when the air through the castle windows carried the smell of thawed earth and pine and the distant suggestion of warmth returning, Tristan found her in the eastern gallery at the window, where the valley spread green and gold below. He stood beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his cheek briefly against her hair. There was no ceremony that evening, no council, no petition, no decision requiring the weight of 5 territories, just the valley below and the light going amber across the hills, and 2 people standing quietly in the space they had built, not from grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but from honesty and time, and the willingness on both their parts to keep choosing. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. In the years that followed, the Wren line was formally restored to the kingdom's record of honored bloodlines. The Healer's Charter became the foundation of a broader protection extending to all Omega settlements in the 5 territories. Lord Cedric Hale lived out his remaining years quietly in the western reaches, stripped of title and land, under the supervision of the Crown's appointed steward, small and diminished, and no longer able to harm anyone. Marin lived to see 3 more winters in Castle Valdrin, and declared each one superior to the last. And Josie, who had once stood in a kitchen doorway at midnight with frost on her boots, and ash still warm in the hearth behind her, learned, slowly, and then all at once, that belonging was not something that could be burned.